we've been talking about genetically modified salmon, this Aquadvantage, and I want to know, is it an advantage? Let's look at both sides of it. So first of all, there is an increased demand for salmon. There's an increased demand for salmon. Did I just mess you up completely over there? All right. I guess I could go through that screen too, I suppose. Yeah, given the projected population growth, the global demand, and not just population growth, but development of the world's economies, right? And the changing of the population and the kinds of diet that they're going to be having. They project the global demand for protein is going to double from what it is today by 2050. Double. The demand for protein is going to double. So, where is that protein coming from? Can the planet really support that much beef? No, it can't, is the answer. So people are looking to aquaculture. Salmon consumption already is 3 times higher than it was in the 80s, which is remarkable. And of the fish that is consumed, 50% of it is produced by aquaculture. That means farm-raised fish. That's fish that were either grown in offshore pens, coastal pens, or land-based farm fishing. So this production of salmon is actually the world's fastest growing food production. If you want to think about what food production is ramping up the most quickly on Earth, it's the production of salmon. So 70% of that aquaculture market is of all fish that's produced in farms is some kind of a salmon. So it's a rapidly growing, rapidly expanding demand and production's rising to that demand. Used to be back in the 80s that a piece of salmon, I know this may be hard to conceive, but a piece of salmon was considered to be a very high-end fish. It was kind of an exclusive fish that living in the Midwest, far away from salmon stocks, we hardly ever ate it. Myself, my family, and it was something that was more of an elite dish, whereas now it's considered to be quite a common fish for consumption. So you can see there the wild catch of fish is just a thin slice, whereas the production of total salmon production via aquaculture has exploded since the late 80s. Of all that salmon in aquaculture, the vast majority of it is Atlantic salmon, and there's quite a bit of rainbow trout. These are geographically distributed. It depends upon where you are in the country or the world as to what kind of fish you're going to be able to have the most access to. But most of the production is in Atlantic salmon, the fish that used to swim offshore in great numbers right here in the Gulf of Maine. Does anybody, by the way, I'm not covering this, does anybody know why the Atlantic salmon fishery has taken such a, the wild catch is gone here in the Gulf of Maine essentially? Yeah, what?
Too warm.
Okay, there's one thing. That's not the primary driver. What's the primary drivers? Anybody know? So it takes a little bit of understanding of the salmon life cycle. Salmon migrate up. The adult salmon that are spawning migrate up the rivers, like the Kennebec River here in Waterville, to spawn up in the streams, the headwaters of those rivers. And those headwaters are, by and large, inaccessible to the Atlantic salmon in the Gulf of Maine because of impoundment, damming of the rivers. Also, there is the need for, so they spawn, the eggs hatch, the fry hatch, and they grow up to the point of a smolt, which, you know, is a fish like about that long, and then they swim downstream in the spring to get to the ocean. And what's another part of that life cycle that's been disrupted is the alewife run. So does anybody know what alewife are? Alewife are a cold water fish like a herring or something like that, a little bit larger, they're about like this big. About the same size as an Atlantic salmon smolt, and they co-migrate. Alewife go up the river while the Atlantic salmon smolt were meant to go down, and the alewife fishery in Maine had taken a huge hit. But there has been some progress with that. There's been dam removal and the restoration of the alewife fishery. It's come back, actually. It's a success story. Not to the historical levels, but they are running. And the reason they need to have the alewife running in this direction while the salmon are going in that direction, it's a cover species for those Atlantic salmon smolts, prevent predation from osprey and whatever else. So there's literally millions of alewife going in one direction, and then the thousands of Atlantic salmon would be sort of hiding in the crowd of the alewife running in the other direction. If you've never seen it, the alewife run, maybe we should do that for a lab. That would be fun to go down and watch the the alewife run in Damariscotta. That might be a cool. No, Damariscotta is maybe like a 50-minute drive. Yeah, it would take a whole lab to get down there, check it out, and come back. But it's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing. We could go to the one in Benton, actually. Maybe that's what we'll do. It's beautiful. The one in Damariscotta is incredible, though. It feels like you could run across the river on the backs of the fish. There's like more fish in the water than water. It's pretty incredible. Okay, sorry, tangent. So most of the production of this aquaculture salmon is happening in two places. In Scandinavia, Norway in particular, and in Chile. And there's a little bit in British Columbia. There is a little bit you can see here in Nova Scotia. There's a touch in Maine you can see on that map. And some down in Australia and New Zealand, and quite a bit in the UK as well. But the thing is, there's all this production in one place, in these few places on Earth. I want you to look at the geography of that as I switch to this map. And now we can see most of the demand, most of the consumption is not actually located where the production is. All right, there's a problem with this. What's the problem? Pretty obvious one, Theo.
Most of the demand, I know, and most of the production is.
Yeah, well, most of the production is in South America for the Western Hemisphere, and most of the production for the Eastern Hemisphere is in Norway, right? So Norway is quite a ways away from China, and Chile is a little ways away from North America. There's not the North American demand for salmon is not met by the U.S. salmon fishery, not even remotely met by it. So there's a huge cost. There's a huge carbon footprint cost and other aspects to this. So this is something that aquaculture can address, right? Here are a couple of the numbers. Let's just compare fish, chicken, pork, and cows. So first, there's the feed conversion ratio. And this is the pounds of feed that you have to give a fish, the pounds of protein that they need to consume compared to, as a ratio, with the pounds of meat that they put out, right? So a cow has to eat roughly 10 times, eight times its body weight in protein to be able to give you the protein that comes on its carcass. Likewise, a pig is about 4 times its body weight in feed requirements. A chicken is actually pretty efficient. It's about 2 times its body weight in feed to give you to reach the grown state, the grown bird. And fish are the most efficient. So one salmon needs to eat about its body weight plus another 50%, about 1.5 times its body weight to give you a pound, 1.5 pounds of feed for every pound of salmon meat. On the other hand, these Aquadvantage salmon actually require about 25% less feed than wild type fish, meaning that you approach almost for every pound of feed you're putting into them, it's about a pound of meat that you're getting out of them, which is, yeah, that's pretty incredible, actually. That's pretty incredible considering that they are swimming and doing things, too. They need to burn some energy. And if you look at the freshwater requirements for them, the freshwater requirement we're going to look at this number in more detail and actually try to understand what that means. This infographic that I found claims, and I didn't check the source, but it claims that a salmon requires 1 gallon of fresh water, whereas it goes anywhere from 2,000 to 3,500 gallons for pigs, cow, and chicken. For pigs, beef, and chicken. And most of that water in those other animals is from what? Does a pig drink 3,500 gallons of water? Yeah.
Isn't it from their feed?
It's from the feed, yeah. It's from the agricultural needs of feed that goes into feeding those animals. That's right. And then there's the carbon footprint. Right, and so it's tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per ton of edible protein is the ratio that they're giving there, and you can see that the carbon footprint of a cow is the horrendous one. Beef is really has a high carbon footprint. Whereas pigs and chicken are roughly equivalent and about 4 to 5 times that of the carbon footprint of a fish. So there is a real ecological advantage to salmon-derived protein versus the other forms of protein. So here's the idea behind that. If you are the idea behind having this Aquadvantage salmon system, this is land-based aquaculture that is able to be grown proximal to the demand, right? So the idea is to produce the fish where the demand is, so that you can lower the carbon footprint even further and reduce logistic costs and hopefully deliver a fresher product too, because you want fresh fish. So the numbers, according to the source, I can't quite read the source down there, but this came from some sort of third-party analysis NGO that I found. It said transporting this Aquadvantage salmon is roughly 23 to 25 times less carbon than the 2 major sources of Atlantic salmon that are in Chile and Norway. All right. It's not all roses, though. There are some negative impacts. I'm going to go through a couple of those. I don't have pretty pictures for you, sorry. Let me set the timer here. So there are chemical inputs. A lot of aquaculture does use antibiotics, antifoulants, things that help the water, help the waste fall out of the water. Pesticides or other, depending on where the fish was grown, there are banned chemicals that can get used. Say we buy fish that comes from some country that's using a chemical that's banned for production in the U.S., but we're buying the fish that was produced elsewhere, so we have no control over that. Yeah, there can be all kinds of ramifications for the kinds of chemicals that can be used in aquaculture. It has an impact on biodiversity, right? So when you have a huge concentration of fish that's kept in a pen, not moving around, there tends to be a high concentration of food, nutrient waste that from the feed that you're putting on there, and then excrement from the fish themselves. That's really high in nitrogen that can lead to algal blooms and other disturbances of the wildlife, the flora and fauna in that environment. The word for high nutrient water is making water more nutrient rich and causing those algal blooms is eutrophication. That's why I put that word at the end there. Aquaculture does tend to breed a variety of diseases. There are like disease pens in the fish, which can then be transferred to the wild population and really negatively impact an already fragile fishery. And it can be a particular problem if you have fish escapes, these offshore fish pens. A major concern is fish escapes. It happens all the time. Say there's a hurricane offshore, just a big storm, or the nets that keep them penned in break for whatever reason. You can get salmon escaping, and then they can interbreed with the local wild type stocks of the same fish, and that's going to negatively impact the genetic diversity, because those fish that are being farmed in the pens, they're essentially all the same fish. Genetically, they just take a single fish and then they clone them out, and you get thousands and thousands of fish with the exact same genes. If they get out, they can really thin out the gene pool in the wild stocks. So that's a real problem. This is not even considering genetically modified fish. This is just normal aquaculture fish, farm-raised fish. You don't want them getting out. That problem becomes even more acute when we've already kind of covered the implications of a genetically modified fish getting out into the wild type stock, and then having its genes, its gene construct. Maybe you get one out of. So I think the number they said that I read when Aquadvantage is producing the fish, if a batch of fry that they have, if over 5% of them are not sterile, that is breeding capable, then they kill the entire stock. So when they're sampling, if they get over 5% that are able to breed, they kill all the fish, right? But what if one of these fish does get out into the ecosystem? You can imagine those fish would become behemoths and very rapidly destroy the wild type. It would very rapidly outcompete the other salmon, the wild salmon, and who knows what it would do to the food chain, right? Having a fish that was able to eat that much and grow that much that quickly. So escape is a real concern. So nutrient pollution and carrying capacity. This is on both sides. both the fish waste we've talked about. I just mentioned how all that fish waste can lead to algal blooms and really degrade the water quality in the area of the fish farm. But they also require a tremendous amount of food, and what's the actual carrying capacity of the ocean to be able to provide that feed, right? Which I guess is one of the, these are just negative impacts of aquaculture in general. This is actually one of the arguments for genetically modified fish, because there's a less intensive requirement for feed fish for these genetically modified salmon. They can also destabilize already oxygen-deprived waters. Say you have some coastal area that's already oxygen-deprived because of its proximity to humans, a human population, and maybe an estuary that's putting nutrient-rich water into the estuary already. You put a fish farm offshore there, and it's going to exacerbate that problem. And then there are social issues, right? There's a whole host of those. I imagine we could spend a whole week just exploring them. But one of the things that's interesting about aquaculture, just like any large industry, agricultural industry, it opens up the door for labor practice misuse, particularly in countries that are not in the United States, right? It's hard to control the labor practices along the entire supply chain. Yeah. Yeah, you're not. Yeah, I would say that coral is a particularly sensitive aspect of marine ecosystems, and the bulk of coral does exist in fresh, warmer waters, warmer tropical waters. Although there is coral in there's coral offshore here in Maine, and certainly. Nutrient pollution and hypoxia and aquaculture is going to impact that. There's no doubt about it. Although the biggest threats to coral are probably just ocean acidification, just like the ambient level of CO2 in the atmosphere. As it goes up, that CO2 is dissolving in the ocean. It's making the ocean more acidic, and it's dissolving the coral, right, and bleaching it out, and then eventually it dies. It doesn't come back. So. Yeah. If you ever get a chance to talk to Ben Neal in environmental sciences, he studies coral. He's done a lot of really interesting work with coral. He could talk about it a lot more than I could. But anyone else? Any other questions? I'm kind of whipping through it. I am not going to talk about GM past today. I'm really determined to finish it today.
You will eat them.
Huh?
You will eat them. You'll end up eating them.
What, genetically modified fish? I would eat a piece of GM fish. Okay, so Aquadvantage salmon, it is a little bit water and sludge intensive. All right, so here's just a map of a general aquaculture setup. You have water coming in this diagram. You have the water coming in right over here. It gets oxygenated, goes into the fish tank, and then the water comes out, and we filter. There's these mechanical filters that filter out all of the fish crap, which becomes a sludge that is actually a great source of fertilizer. I imagine the sludge gets somehow repurposed into, or maybe not. I don't actually know. I think it probably depends. One of the things is fertilizer itself from companies like whatever agricultural supply company, Monsanto or something, that it's so cheap. Fertilizer is so cheap that currently it's I don't know how what the economics of water, of sludge from aquaculture are. But then it goes through this like filtration process, and they discharge the remaining water either to out into the ocean or some other estuary. It takes a huge amount of water, and it produces a lot of sludge. So here's this very Nordic-looking guy. He is the head of Aquadvantage salmon. And have I talked about this yet? Belfast? I haven't mentioned it yet. Okay, so we've been talking about Aquadvantage. I've been heading here because Maine, Belfast. Anyone been to Belfast? Very, very cool town, very cute town on the coast there. It is set to be the site of the first North American production facility for these genetically modified salmon. Only the second one on Earth. The first is in Denmark. And this is a quote by this guy, and it is, "Our production is dependent on having clean water. One of the reasons we ended up in this region was clean water. Clean, cold water is excellent for salmon." He wants clean, cold water, right? And Maine has clean, cold water. Lots of it. That's actually why Maine, in my opinion, is such a lovely place to ride out global climate change here. We've got a lot of water, a lot of fresh water. But more than that, it's a lot of fresh water near. Am I stealing the thunder of another slide here? I don't know. It's a lot of fresh water near 50 million people, like a huge market, right? We are just a few hours drive from Boston and New York and the rest of the coast here. Philadelphia, there's like 50 million people. Very, very logistically close to Maine in terms of global food supply chains, right? It's right around the corner, and there's not very much production here. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, well, that's a good question. We'll get to that. I don't actually have the number offhand, but I'll show you where you can find that number. It's a great question. And then the third reason they want to locate here in Belfast is there is the history of fishing, right, and general aquaculture in Maine. So there is expertise. There is a workforce in Maine that, along national standards, is willing to work for relatively low wages compared to other places in the country. But there is that expertise here, right? So it's kind of a cherry spot for this company. Did anybody watch these videos? Who watched the videos? Okay, so most of you. It's not, I don't need to show them, do I? Gave you a sense of what's going on. Does anybody want me to show those videos? No? Okay, you can watch them on your own. So let's break this down. I wish I could answer your question about jobs better, because that's the kind of thing. If you just Google Aquadvantage and Belfast, you'll come up with the city of Belfast's page that has like 1 billion links, like YouTube videos of all the city council meetings and all kinds of presentations, and it's like more than you want to look at. But it's all in there somewhere. Exactly how many jobs, I don't know. So what is going to happen here? Let's actually look at the numbers. So the effluent into the Penobscot Bay, into the bay off the coast of Belfast there, they're going to pump 30 million liters per day. 30 million liters per day of water that was originally fresh, clean, cold water, like Eric Heim was so impressed by, is getting just dumped out into the ocean. 185 kilograms per day suspended solids at a concentration of 6.33 milligrams per liter. You know, I don't have a lot of the science background tools in water quality to assess these numbers, but I was putting this slide together and talking to my wife, who does. She's an aquatic ecologist in ES, and she was kind of evaluating these numbers as I was rattling them off. And she said this number is it's relatively high. It's not astronomical, but it's a fairly high number when you're thinking about water quality. 5.8 kilograms per day of phosphorus. That's also a reasonable amount of phosphorus to be just dumping into the ocean. The equivalent of about 20 average lawns. 62 kilograms per day of biochemical oxygen demand. So that means these 185 kilograms of suspended solids, like, this is like feces, essentially, like particulated feces that they weren't able to filter out. That feces or whatever is going to be degrading and sucking up oxygen, right, in the water. So 62 kilograms per day of oxygen demand, that's pulling 62 kilograms of oxygen out of the water. And that is the direct hypoxic cost on the water. And then nitrogen, in terms of the effect on nitrogen, 673 kilograms per day into the bay at a concentration of 23 milligrams per liter. So the EPA's max level of nitrogen in drinking water to be safe. So we've talked about blue baby syndrome. You guys remember that a little bit when I was talking about the nitrogen cycle. That's about 10 milligrams per liter. This is over 2 times that. Of course, the company according to the company's official line, they trot out the solution to pollution is dilution. So just pump it into the ocean and dilute it out so it's not as concentrated and won't be such a problem. Maybe this number, safe drinking water, nobody's drinking ocean water, maybe that's a disingenuous number, is what I was told by my wife. So I did a little bit of a calculation. I guess I'll get to that in a moment. She said that maybe a better comparison is to look at nitrogen flux. All right, between the Belfast, what they're saying with the nitrogen flux. So flux is how much nitrogen is passing through that system at per unit of time. All right, what's the mass of nitrogen per unit of time? And compare that into something that we know is has this kind of a problem, the hypoxic zone. So I want to just compare it to the most famous one in North America, the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi Basin hypoxic zone. So I went and found some data from a USGS report that was published, and the largest, so that blue triangle on the right there represents that's the area of hypoxic zone, the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico off the coast of Louisiana. We're going to compare to the largest of those that happened in the 20th century. That happened in 1999, was the largest hypoxic zone. And we get these massive fish kills, these dead fish over here. And this is the size of the hypoxic zone back in 99. So let's compare the fluxes. What we need is the kilograms per year and the liters per second of kilograms per year of nitrogen and the flow, which is the liters per second of the Gulf of the Mississippi into the Gulf. And if you do the calculation, you end up with 1.6 milligrams of nitrogen per liter per second. All right, that's the flux that led to the largest hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico. The Belfast proposal at 30 million liters per day, that's 600, and they say 673 kilograms per day into the bay at a concentration of 23 milligrams per liter. That 23 milligrams per liter is actually a flux. So you can see that the flux in the Gulf of Mexico in 99 was 1.6 milligrams per liter per second, and the Belfast proposal is actually 23 milligrams per liter per second. So well above, way above what is getting the flux, the concentration flux. Now, I'll get to you in a second. Now, I want you to understand these numbers. There's way more nitrogen going into the ocean at the Gulf of Mexico, right? It's way more. But flux is just a way of looking at how much nitrogen is passing through that system per volume, per liter, per unit of time. Yeah, Josh?
Well, is that a fair comparison? Because you're using the total flow of the Mississippi, only what's being produced, is it being put directly into the base?
So the thing is, the level of the size of the hypoxic zone, all of the flux that you have from the Gulf of Mexico, the size, that actual rate, the kilograms per year, is what's going to give you the size of the hypoxic zone, right? And that whatever hypoxia would be happening in Belfast would be scaled according to the absolute mass of nitrogen that you're dumping into the Penobscot Bay. Do you understand what I'm saying? So yeah, maybe it's not a completely fair comparison. Maybe the best comparison would be looking at effluent out of some other aquaculture, some non-genetically modified aquaculture facility into whatever ecosystem that it's sited in. But I was just trying to make a rough comparison here. Yeah. No, I don't think this is going to make Maine look like the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah, but how many?
It's a great question. I mean, if you look at the numbers here, right, the Gulf of Mexico is receiving 3, 6, 7 orders of 8 more orders of magnitude more nitrogen than the Gulf of Mexico. So this is getting to Josh's point. Well, that's not really a fair comparison either. But the rate at which it's going into the Penobscot Bay, that rate is in far excess of the absolute rate that it's going into the Gulf of the flux rate is higher than what's going into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, I understand that the absolute volume is way larger going into the Gulf of Mexico, which is leading to the problem. But yeah.
No, I think my point was more that the $30 million liters a day solely coming from the facility.
Yeah.
So, but you're measuring from the Mississippi River, which has like a whole set of different pollutions in it, but it is itself. It is not just.
It's the waste. Well, the facility in the Gulf of Mexico is everything in gray, right? So that the whole Mississippi River basin is analogous to the fish farm in Belfast, is what I'm saying. So it's like vastly different scales. The Gulf of Mexico is going hypoxic because it's receiving water from the Mississippi. The Mississippi is like the effluent pipe out of the facility. Am I not understanding your question still?
Yeah, I'm just thinking, because you're looking at only what's being taken away from the facility that's producing, whereas you're looking at the situation in the river and the other, which does get like a lot of waste from this entire basin. So it is going to
yeah, it's diluted, but it's not diluted enough. I mean, it's diluted, but it still has a level of nitrogen that is leading to eutrophication and hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico, right? I mean, sure, it's been diluted by all the inputs that are in the catchment, in the watershed catchment, but the flux is so imagine if the Mississippi was receiving 1,000 times more water. All right. That's a huge amount of water, right? An enormous amount of water. And you're dumping all of that water into the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, there's a volume thing. It's going to, that nitrogen, and you're not changing the nitrogen at all, that the concentrations of nitrogen that are in that water will be significantly lower. I mean, this is the solution, pollution, dilution, axiom or whatever. The thing with the Gulf of Mexico is that there is a large volume of nitrogen of sufficient concentration to cause eutrophication, because ocean water in general is extremely low in nitrogen. Like the nitrogen in that's not ambient levels. That's way above ambient levels. There's almost, if you ever go out in a boat into the ocean, away from shore, beyond 30 miles away from shore, go out into the ocean, it's bright blue, right? It's clear blue because there's no nitrogen in that water. It's just water. And so if you start dumping a bunch of nitrogen from a watershed into it, you're going to change that dynamic, and it's going to be very, very susceptible to changes in the background nitrogen. Am I getting at your question? No?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, so my point was, what are some options you would propose? Oh, shoot, I'm running out of time. What can we do with this water? It's a hell of a lot of water to be thrown that has nitrogen in it and phosphorus in it. It seems like that would be a reasonable proposal for something to do to maybe mitigate the potential for environmental impact here. All right. I have an activity that I really wanted to do with you guys. Okay. So, this is where we get into the political realm of this. Aquadvantage salmon was first created in '89. Clinton administration, reacting to the public skepticism, had dug their heels in. Bush, too, wanted to expedite the approval process, and during Bush 2, Aquadvantage got classified as a drug rather than as a food, because drug and food have different regulatory mechanisms, processes behind them. So that began to expedite it, but then the administration flipped to Obama, and so the Obama administration, because of the political dynamics around it, really conspired to delay the salmon's approval for political gain, apparently. Just prior to the second midterms, the year after the second midterms in 2014, the FDA did approve the fish in November of 2015. So the meat was first commercially available in 2017, but it has stalled in the U.S. Due to a, quote, lack of labeling infrastructure. So what's interesting about this is the unique politics of the moment around salmon. So, we know that the Senate is closely divided, and these sort of swing senators, Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, two moderate Republicans, both of which live in states with large salmon fisheries, a stake in the game, right? Lisa Murkowski, whose state has not been considered for a site for this aquaculture installation, has come out against Aquadvantage. This is a tweet she put out. "I won't accept this, quote, fake fish to be sold in stores without clear labeling. Huge difference because between frankenfish and wild, healthy, sustainably caught." So she's sticking up for her constituents there, right? Which is one of the reasons the Trump administration, managing those votes, they look for ways that you can throw a bone to a senator here or there, and the Trump administration has dragged its feet on labeling infrastructure because of the concerns of Lisa Murkowski. On the other side is Susan Collins, and she has talked about the need for labeling. She just wants it labeled because she's getting it from both sides here in the fishery, right? So it's a highly contentious issue here in the state of Maine, right? There's a lot of people in Maine that want it because of jobs and et cetera, but there's a lot of people in the wild fishery who do not want it. Okay, so I'm just going to make the last point on this, and that is these are in Europe. We talked about Europe's laws. There are a bunch of international GMO laws. The ones in green have a ban on GMOs. The ones in orange have no ban, and then Norway has an extremely strict ban. So no GMOs are to be grown or sold in Norway. One of the counties, Oppland, is declared GMO free. That means no GMOs are even allowed in there, much less bought or sold. You're not allowed to have any GMOs in there. They're illegal to possess. And then the largest seed vault on Earth, the biggest seed bank, is in Svalbard, Norway. They also ban seeds from there. I'm pointing to this because Norway, this is a Norwegian company. Aquadvantage is a Norwegian company that wants to come and do this, but they're looking to other countries to establish their technology, their systems, because it's completely unacceptable to their own countrymen and women. All right, so I didn't quite get everything out that I wanted, but that's that.